This is the story of how the last novel, Daniel Deronda, written by George Eliot, that was the pen name of Marianne Evans, inspired the Zionist movement in the modern state of Israel. This is actually our 21st conversation in this historical series. We've been talking about probably the greatest Hebrew scholar that the English-speaking world ever produced, Christian David Ginsburg, and we've been looking at his work on the Moabite Stone, a smashing archaeological find that came out in the early 1870s. So the second edition of Ginsburg's book on the Moabite Stone came out in 1872, and Ginsburg dedicated it to Emanuel Deutsch as a token of his esteem for him. Both of these men were great Middle Eastern, Semitic, Hebrew scholars. Ginsburg himself was 39 at the time of this writing and dedication, and Emanuel Deutsch was 43. So there's about 4 years between them. And I'll show you a quick note here in the opening pages of Ginsburg's book. He mentions there was a very instructive volume entitled The Recovery of Jerusalem. There was a chapter that was devoted to the Moabite Stone, and it was supposed to have been written by Mr. Deutsch, but, quote, ill health prevented his writing it. Ginsburg notes this is all the more to be regretted, since Deutsch was he was the first to correct some of Mr. Gano's mistranslations, and he also called attention to the importance of this lapidary document. Ginsburg also honors him as mentioning that he's one of the very few scholars in England who could do justice to this unparalleled relic. So anyway, apparently Mr. Deutsch's illness was really quite disappointing for Ginsburg and as you'll see, for many other people. As it turns out, Deutsch was 43 at the time, died a year later of what was probably stomach cancer. But what I really want you to note here is just the honor that Ginsburg had for Mr. Deutsch, and also this dedication, which will lead into this story about George Eliot and her final novel. So this is a little entry about Emanuel Deutsch himself, and from the Jewish Encyclopedia. Emanuel Oscar Menachem Deutsch was his full name, and I'm actually not going to point anything out to you in this little article. We will be doing that in a couple more conversations when we look at this figure himself. Right now we're more going to be talking about George Eliot and her friendship with him. What I will point out to you here is what isn't here. There is no mention of his friendship with Marianne Evans. Surprisingly, he was her Hebrew teacher. She called him her dear rabbi. Deutsch inspired her last novel, Daniel Deronda, which went on to inspire the Zionist movement more than anything else. In fact, I would even say that if some of the more famous Zionist fathers, like Eliezer Ben Yehuda, who almost single-handedly restored Hebrew as a modern language, or Theodor Herzl, who is often known as the father of modern Zionism, especially politically, if these men were known as the fathers of Zionism, then we could say that George Eliot was the grandmother of modern Zionism in the state of Israel, and Emanuel Deutsch was the grandfather. Although, having said that, as you'll see in this story, if Emanuel Deutsch and Marianne Evans played such a critical role in inspiring the original Zionist vision, is it possible that they were actually the true father and the true mother of Zionism? I'll put that question in your mind, and let's look at this together and see what we can discover about these two and their friendship and the novel that started it all. So here's a little entry from Wikipedia about Marianne Evans. I will be referring to her alternately in this conversation as Marianne Evans and as George Eliot. It lists her 7 novels when they came out, and then as you can see here, the last novel was Daniel Deronda, which came out in 1876. And if you want to learn more about her, feel free to look her up, and you can do more research on your own time, although certainly you will be learning more about her as we progress in this conversation. So this will probably be a good starting point for you. we'll especially be covering some of the details of George Eliot's life that aren't mentioned in many narratives, because she had a very strong Jewish chapter in her story, especially towards the end of her life, as you can see here. Eliot was called the greatest English novelist of her time. You saw how Daniel Deronda was the last of her 7 novels. Let's go ahead now and explore the story more. You're going to learn why Daniel Deronda was called the first Zionist manifesto, and why eminent historian Paul Johnson said that in terms of its practical effects, Daniel Deronda was probably the most influential novel of the 19th century. We already mentioned Eliezer Ben Yehuda, whom I'll get out of the way here so you can see a little bit more, whom you can see here. Eliezer Ben Yehuda, as I mentioned, you may know this, it's as it says here, he was the driving force behind the revival of the Hebrew language in the modern era. In fact, he was really lit up with the Zionist vision before Herzl. In some ways, I think Ben Yehuda is more deserving of the title father of modern Zionism even than Theodor Herzl. Definitely, it's not like there was only a single person. It was a vision that gripped many people, and that they worked towards and made a reality. Eliezer Ben Yehuda said this: "One day I was told of a character in an English novel," you know which novel that is, "who had the very same dream." He's referring to the dream that he had, the dream for the Jewish people to return to the land of Israel and have a state of their own, become a nation once again. This very same dream. After I had read this story a few times, I made up my mind and I acted. I went to Paris in order to learn and equip myself there with the information needed for my work in the land of Israel. That's a quote from, a translated quote, equivocating what Ben Yehuda said. He read this story a couple times, and that was the last thing he needed. He made up his mind, and he acted. I'm going to show you several more men and women who were influential in early Zionism, and I will mention their relationship with this the story of Daniel Deronda. Peretz Smolenskin, known as the father of cultural Zionism, and you can see down here it mentions that he founded Hashachar, which is the Dawn, a Hebrew journal that became a literary platform for the Haskalah movement and early Jewish nationalism. And Smolenskin quoted, he read the novel, he quoted from it, and it sounds like he also translated it with this gentleman, Aaron David Gordon, who was another early Zionist who was very influential through his organizing and his writing. And again, feel free to pause this if you want to go into this in greater detail. We already mentioned Theodor Herzl more than anyone else. He's known as the father of Zionism. Herzl read, he knew of the novel Daniel Deronda. At some point, he noted it in his journal before he wrote Der Judenstaat, which is the Jewish state, very influential early Zionist book that we'll learn more about in just a couple of minutes. And Herzl was also said to be seen reading it on the eve of the First Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897. Herzl also noted in his journal that he met a man named Albert Goldsmid, whom you can see here, who actually told Herzl, "I am Daniel Deronda." Goldsmid identified so closely with the hero of the story that he was actually able to say this to Herzl. No, he wasn't crazy. He didn't literally believe that he was a fictionary character, but he was just so gripped by the story that this is what he said to Herzl. And yes, we will be exploring this story, the storyline, some of the key characters a little bit later in this conversation. Just in case you're wondering, you may want to pause this and read a little bit more if you want to learn more about some of these people. By the way, you can get a little bit more of his story and why he would have identified with this. It even says actually in here in Wikipedia, in his later years, he identified himself as the living personification of George Eliot's Daniel Deronda. Eliot's book was transformative for Zionist development and understanding amongst Jews and non-Jews. That was Colonel Albert Goldsmid. Nachum Sokolov said that Daniel Deronda paved the way for Zionism. Emma Lazarus read the novel and was inspired and became an early influential Zionist. You may have heard about her in school. She wrote the poem "The New Colossus," which there's a quotation from it on the bronze plaque at the foot of the Statue of Liberty. And specifically, I'm sure you've heard the line, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." So this was written by Emma Lazarus, who was an early Zionist and who was inspired to become that by this novel. Another woman who was inspired by Daniel Deronda was Henrietta Zold, who was pretty much everywhere and did everything in the emergence of the Zionist movement. Feel free to pause this and look over some of it. She's famous for founding Hadassah, the women's Zionist organization of America. Notably, as something of a Hebrew teacher and scholar myself, it jumped out at me that she edited Marcus Jastro's Talmudic dictionary. If you're into Hebrew, you've probably consulted Jastrow before. Well, that has Henrietta Zold's fingerprints on it. In fact, in Israel, Mother's Day is celebrated on the anniversary of Henrietta Zold's death, and she was another one who read Daniel Deronda and was lit up by the early Zionist vision. Another was the energetic and enthusiastic David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister. He was another one of those people who basically had his fingers in all of the early Zionist pies. As it says here in the Wikipedia article, he became known as Israel's founding father. He read the novel and was very inspired by it, as was not only Israel's first prime minister, but Israel's first president, Chaim Weizmann. He noted that he kept the novel within easy reach in his bedroom. Abba Eban, who was an early, I can't tell if he was the first or not, but if he wasn't the first, he was definitely, as you can see here, he was either the first or one of the first of Israel's representatives to the UN, and then also an early ambassador to the United States. In Abba Eban's speech upon Israel's independence, he referred to George Eliot as, quote, one of our first visionaries. In fact, I would even argue, as you will see as we continue with this conversation, that George Eliot was in fact the first visionary. Another famous mother in Israel, so to speak, was Golda Meir. She had a copy on her shelf, no doubt read it, and was inspired. And to reflect the influence that the story of Daniel Deronda had on the formation of the modern state of Israel, there are actually streets named after George Eliot in Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv, and in Haifa. So just to give you a little bit of a time frame here on when this novel came out and just how influential it was. Here are copies of the original novels. The novel, broken up into parts, really. It began coming out in 1876. And we'll be having a closer look at the actual novel and storyline in just a little bit here. Right now we'll just stick to the timeline. So it began coming out in 1876. This was 6 years before the famous document Auto Emancipation was written in 1882. As you can see here, it's considered a founding document of modern Jewish nationalism, especially Zionism. Many would say this was like the first Zionist document that really took root, so to speak. Daniel Deronda was published 10 years before the term Zionism was even coined and used. Generally, it's believed that it was coined by Nathan Birnbaum. And again, feel free to pause this and you can read a little bit about Birnbaum. So basically, Daniel Deronda was this Zionist story written 10 years before the term Zionism was even used. So 10 years before Zionism was used, and 20 years before Zionism really became a popular term through the writing of Theodor Herzl in his book Der Judenstaat, or The Jewish State. And you can see here also it says Herzl popularized the term Zionism, which was coined by Nathan Birnbaum. So this was a full 20 years before this work came out. So my question is, if all of these fathers and mothers of Zionism were inspired through the story of Daniel Deronda, which was written by Marianne Evans and was inspired by Emanuel Deutsch, who were the original true fathers and mothers of Zionism? Could we say that that Evans and Deutsch were the original father and mother of Zionism? If not, I think we could definitely say that they were the grandfather and grandmother of Zionism and the modern state of Israel. So why don't we have a look at this novel itself, and let's see if we can get a feel for what was so powerful about it, what it did to grip an entire generation the way it did. So once again, this is Wikipedia. The nice thing is, if I'm going too fast, or if this writing, for instance, is a little too small, you can look it up and read it for yourself on Wikipedia in large print. I'll just note a couple things here for you. We're just kind of use this as a something to work off of. So you'll notice here it says the work's mixture of social satire and moral searching, along with its sympathetic rendering of the Jewish proto-Zionist ideas, has made it the controversial final statement of one of the most renowned Victorian novelists. So you'll notice here the term proto-Zionist is used. That's a great term because, as we learned, the term Zionism wasn't even coined until 10 years later, and didn't really become popular until 20 years later with the advent of Theodor Herzl's book about the Jewish state. So there are a couple of things I'll point out to you in the little plot summary here. And then it also has a description of the characters, which we'll look at the next page. So basically, the story starts with Daniel Deronda and a non-Jewish woman named Gwendolyn Harleth, who is in the opening scene. She's gambling, rather headstrong, mercurial, has quite the temper. Anyway, so interesting there. So the story goes on. One day, Duronda is boating, and he rescues, as it says here, a young Jewish woman, Mira Lapidoth, from attempting to drown herself. So that is where the Jewish element of the story really enters, with this young woman who attempts to drown herself. Moving on a little bit more, down to the bottom right here, it says she had come to London looking for her some lost family members. And she couldn't find them, and that's why she was going to kill herself. And so, anyway, so Duronda, he's really quite a helpful person, and he goes looking for her family. And he, in the process of that, it says he meets a consumptive visionary named Mordecai. Mordecai is basically Emanuel Deutsch, as you'll see many times over in this conversation. I'll just mention that right now. Mordecai passionately proclaims his wish for the Jewish people to retain their national identity and one day be restored to their promised land. Because he's dying, he wants Daniel to become his intellectual heir and continue to pursue his dream and be an advocate for the Jewish people. Although he's strongly drawn to Mordecai, Duronda hesitates to commit himself to a cause that seems to have no connection to his own identity. At this point, Duronda doesn't know he's Jewish. He doesn't know his familiar origins, but he does know he's Jewish. Duronda's desire to embrace Mordecai's vision becomes stronger when they discover Mordecai is Mira's brother. Still, Duronda doesn't believe that he's a Jew and cannot reconcile this fact with his affection and respect for Mordecai/Ezra, he goes by both names, which would be necessary for him to pursue a life of Jewish advocacy. And then the story summary ends here. Actually, let's read the last little bit here. All right, so Duronda meets his mother and learns that she was a famous Jewish opera singer with whom Sir Hugo was once in love. That's his kind of adoptive father, basically, or legal guardian at the very least. She tells him that her father, a physician and strictly pious Jew, forced her to marry her cousin whom she didn't love. She resented the rigid piety of her childhood. Daniel was the only child of that union, and on her husband's death, she asked the devoted Sir Hugo to raise her son as an English gentleman, never to know that he was Jewish. Upon learning of his true origins, Duronda finally feels comfortable with his love for Mira, and on his return to England, It's funny. It even has the novel dated in October 1866. He tells Mira this and commits himself to be Ezra/Mordecai's disciple. Before Daniel marries Mira, he goes to Gwendolyn to tell her about his origins, his decision to go to the East, and his betrothal to Mira. Gwendolyn is devastated by the news, but it becomes a turning point in her life, inspiring her to finally say, "I shall live." She sends him a letter on his wedding day, telling him not to think of her with sadness, but to know that she will be a better person for having known him. The newlyweds are all prepared to set off for the East with Mordecai, when Mordecai dies in their arms, and the novel ends. So basically, if you want like kind of a Jane Austen-esque style story that will inspire you to advocate for the Jewish people, read Daniel Deronda. All right, so he gives a little summary of some of the characters. Let's read about Duronda, Mira, and Ezra Mordecai Cohen specifically, because that's the Jewish element that we're really focusing on. So Daniel Deronda was the ward of the wealthy Sir Hugo Mallinger and hero of the novel. Deronda has a tendency to help others at a cost to himself. At the start of the novel, he's failed to win a scholarship at Cambridge because of his focus on helping a friend. He's been traveling abroad and has just started studying law. He often wonders about his birth and whether or not he's a gentleman. As he moves more and more among the world within a world of the Jews of the novel, he begins to identify with their cause, in direct proportion to the unfolding revelations of his ancestry. Eliot used the story of Moses as part of her inspiration for Duronda. As Moses was a Jew brought up as an Egyptian, who ultimately led his people to the promised land, so Duronda is a Jew brought up as an Englishman who ends the novel with a plan to do the same. Duronda's name presumably indicates that his ancestors lived in the Spanish city of Ronda prior to the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492. And it does turn out he's somewhat Sephardic at the very least. All right, and then here's Mira Lapidoth, or I don't know how you'd say that in English. Lapidot is how it would be in Hebrew. Anyways, a beautiful Jewish girl who was born in England, but taken away by her father at a young age to travel the world as a singer. Realizing as a young woman that her father planned to sell her as a mistress to a European nobleman to get money for his gambling addiction, she flees from him and returns to London to look for her mother and brother. When she arrived in London, she found her old home destroyed and no trace of her family. Giving into despair, she tries to commit suicide. Rescued by Daniel, she's cared for by his friends while searching for her family and work so that she can support herself. And then finally, Ezra Mordecai Cohen is Mira's brother, a young Jewish visionary suffering from consumption who befriends Daniel Deronda and teaches him about Judaism. A Kabbalist and proto-Zionist. Basically, this could be talking, by the way, about Emanuel Deutsch. Mordecai sees Duronda as a spiritual successor and inspires him to continue his vision of creating a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. Named after the biblical character Mordecai, who delivers the Jews from the machinations of Haman in the book of Esther. Interestingly enough, he also has this name Ezra. Ezra, as you know, led the Jewish return from the Babylonian exile to the land of Israel, back to Judea to resettle the land and rebuild the temple. So both of these names were picked by George Eliot very intentionally. All right, so moving on from the Wikipedia article and some of these descriptions, you may be interested to know that the BBC actually came out with a TV miniseries based on this story in 2002. So once again, if you're into Jane Austen-esque novels, you may totally be into this. Look it up. You can watch it. And I watched it, and it wasn't very text heavy. Let's say that. The actual novel. We're going to look at some pages from the actual novel. Very, very conversation heavy. This is focuses a little bit more on the action and moves the story along, but still it's great. So I would recommend it personally. Notably, Audible also came out with a shortened, edited and dramatized audio version of Daniel Deronda. This was only in 2018. I listened to this 5-minute sample and it sounded pretty good. So that's something that you might be interested in also. You can also get Daniel Deronda. You can order it. Lots of copies of it on Amazon. This book was printed, reprinted, reprinted over and over again. So there are old copies, there are newer copies. I personally really love old books. You can get old copies that probably have that nice old book smell if you're into that. So look that up if you're interested in getting a copy of this novel. It's really long, and as you'll see, it's not the quickest, easiest reading. I'm trying to remember if it was something like 1,200 pages, something like 80 chapters. It's a long novel. And you could see how it was actually broken up into 8 shorter books, installments that were coming out. Yeah, so look that up. We also do have we're going to be looking at an early PDF version of the novel right away here together. And we do have that PDF also in our collection of PDFs that function as our source texts in this historical series. Look for the PDF collection link probably under this video or somewhere around it, depending on where you're watching it. And you can get that PDF collection for yourself, and that will include this specific version of Daniel Deronda that we will now be looking at. All right, so let's look at the novel. This is how we're going to finish this conversation. We're just going to be looking at this novel and some of the key passages, some of the early little speeches, so to speak, from Mordecai that really lit up that first generation of Zionists. So you'll notice the little titles here. I know they're a little hard to read, so let's see here. So this says, okay, interesting. It looks like it's laid out not in perfect order. So book 1 here says The Spoiled Child. That's a reference to Gwendolyn. Meeting streams, maidens choosing, Gwendolyn gets her choice. All right, so this is book 4. Okay, so finally here in book 5, Mordecai. That's where the Jewish storyline really kicks in with Mordecai. So as you can see, it's halfway through the novel series already, and then book 5 is, if I'm not mistaken, is this book 5? Revelations, then the mother and the son, and then finally fruit and seed. So having given you that little overview of these books, we're actually going to be jumping in, as you can see here, in chapter 38. So about halfway through, specifically with Mordecai, because it was Daniel Deronda's encounter with Mordecai that lit him up with the Zionist vision. So I think that's the part that we'll find most interesting and relevant specifically from our historical perspective. If you just love, Jane Austen-esque romantic novels, then definitely read the first half. You can read all about Gwendolyn, all about Daniel Deronda, all about their interactions and Gwendolyn's adventures. So this is chapter 38, but I will mention that it's in chapter 33 that Duronda meets Mordecai. In the next chapter, he joins the family for their Erev Shabbat dinner, so that's Friday evening supper, starting the Sabbath. And as we begin to read some of these passages, I want you to imagine with me. I want you to imagine being young Eliezer Ben Yehuda in Russia, reading this novel for the first time. I want you to imagine being Theodor Herzl, reading this novel for the first time. Imagine being Emil Lazarus. Imagine being Golda Meir. Any of these early Zionist visionaries who really went on to implement the vision and make that dream a reality. I also want you to imagine being the authoress. I want you to imagine being Mary Ann Evans, and I want you to imagine, what inspired her to write this, especially as she writes about Mordecai. I want you to imagine being her and writing about your friend Emanuel Deutsch, who only died a year or two before you wrote this novel. And as you hear the vision of Mordecai, I just want you to imagine the voice of Emanuel Deutsch behind Mordecai, because it really was. That's who it was. It was Emanuel Deutsch behind the fictional figure of Mordecai, and it was his visionary passion that was behind the speeches that Mordecai gave, and that lit up Daniel Deronda in this fictional story, but that really did light up the first generation of Zionists and send them on their return to Israel. All right, so chapter 38. I'm actually just going to read some sections to you here. I'll try to do it in a way that would most fit the story and maybe communicate some of that initial excitement and passion. If you don't like my reading voice, you can just feel free to look up this novel and read it for yourself. Or else you might, I'm going to show you some specific excerpts that are some of the most famous passages from the novel. So if you're not interested in reading all 1,200 pages or whatever, feel free to just, you can just skip ahead, when you hit the right key button, what is it? You can skip ahead like 15 seconds at a shot and just read them yourself. That's fine. So anyways, we'll go over this however you would like. So we'll begin here with this little, let's see here. Let me get set up here we'll have a little reading together session here. Okay, so let's begin with a little with George Eliot's description of Mordecai. She refers to him as the consumptive-looking Jew, apparently a fervid student of some kind, getting his crust by a quiet handicraft like Spinoza, and this fitted into none of Duronda's anticipations. Reading on, it was otherwise with the effect of their meeting on Mordecai. For many winters, while he had been conscious of an ebbing physical life and a widening spiritual loneliness, all his passionate desire had centered itself in the yearning for some young ear into which he could pour his mind as a testament, some soul kindred enough to accept the spiritual product of his own brief, painful life as a mission to be executed. All right, so right there, can you hear George Eliot herself, Marianne Evans? Can you hear perhaps how she felt about her friendship with Emanuel Deutsch, her conversations with him as her weekly Hebrew teacher? And can you also maybe feel it already as Eliezer Ben Yehuda, Emma Lazarus, any of these early readers? Can you just feel it? Maybe you can feel it already. Just they're like, wow, there was this vision, and he needs to pour it into someone as a mission to be executed. It was remarkable that the hopefulness, which is often the beneficent illusion of consumptive patience, was in Mordecai wholly diverted from the prospect of bodily recovery and carried into the current of this yearning for transmission. The yearning, which had panted upward from out of overwhelming discouragement, had grown into a hope, the hope into a confident belief, which, instead of being checked by the clear conception he had of his hastening decline, took rather the intensity of expectant faith in a prophecy which is only brief space to get fulfilled in. All right, so this is the way chapter 38 begins, describing Duronda and his interactions with Mordecai and the way he sees him. Next page. We'll read on here a little bit. So this is continuing what Mordecai was looking for in his successor, so to speak. He imagined a man who would have all the elements necessary for sympathy with him, but in an embodiment unlike his own. He must be a Jew, intellectually cultured, morally fervid, in all this, a nature ready to be plenished from Mordecai's. But his face and frame must be beautiful and strong. He must have been used to all the refinements of social life. His voice must flow with a full and easy current. His circumstances be free from sordid need. He must glorify the possibilities of the Jew, not sit and wander as Mordecai did, bearing the stamp of his people amid the signs of poverty and waning breath. Goes on to talk about how he would look at paintings in galleries, just imagining the way he wanted his successor to look, and even then he didn't exactly get what he was looking for, looking at those paintings. So moving on a little bit here, we'll go here. All right, so this is really quite interesting. There are going to be several mentions here to the Kabbalists, Jewish mystics, and certain beliefs, doctrines that they had. Interestingly enough, George Eliot, she did a ton of homework preparing for this novel. She learned from Emanuel Deutsch himself, and she also did a lot of her own reading. And one of the books that she read was about the Kabbalah, which came out only a short time prior, written by Christian David Ginsburg, who we've been talking about in this historical series. So it's interesting that Ginsburg and Marianne Evans also had a connection, and you can even feel the faint fingerprints, so to speak, of Ginsburg's work on this novel. So it's really quite interesting. So, anyways, having pointed that out, let's continue reading a little bit here. It was and hence it was that his imagination had constructed another man who would be something more ample than the second soul bestowed, according to the notion of the Kabbalists, to help out the insufficient first, who would be a blooming human life, ready to incorporate all that was worthiest in an existence whose visible, palpable part was burning itself fast away. Again, you can just hear Eliot's recent memories. Her dear rabbi, Emmanuel Deutsch had died only a year or two before she began writing this, and we'll be looking at that exact timeline in our next conversation, when we'll be looking more closely at the actual friendship between George Eliot and Emmanuel Deutsch. But here you can definitely hear her recent memories of watching this dear man just fade away before her very eyes. Obviously very emotionally difficult, and obviously this story is a testament to him. All right, so let's continue reading here with a little bit of that. His inward need for the conception of this expanded, prolonged self was reflected as an outward necessity. The thoughts of his heart, that ancient phrase best shadows the truth, seemed to him too precious, too closely inwoven with the growth of things not to have a further distant destiny. And as the more beautiful, the stronger, the more executive self took shape in his mind, he loved it beforehand with an affection half identifying, half contemplative and grateful. And notice here this phrase, the more executive self. This really is what the readers of this novel became. They became that executive self. If you're familiar with how movements work, you'll usually have that visionary who casts the vision, so to speak, and is impassioned. And then that visionary will light up a group of people who will go on to actually become the executors of that vision and make the dream come true, which is exactly what happened in the Zionist movement. And as you can see here, who is the visionary? Wow. All right, so let's continue. So this is page, it's not like the page is straight through, so I'm not going to refer to the pages here because, this is in this section about Mordecai, it's this page. It's probably more like page 500 or 600 or something. Okay, but anyways, we're going to skip on to where Mordecai and Dan, as he's sometimes referred to, they have the talk. And we'll begin right here. Mordecai begins to speak. You cannot know what has guided me to you and brought us together at this moment. You're wondering. I'm not impatient, said Duronda. I'm ready to listen to whatever you may wish to disclose. You see some of the reasons why I needed you, said Mordecai, speaking quietly, as if he wished to reserve his strength. You see that I am dying. You see that I am as one shut up behind bars by the wayside, who, if he spoke to any, would be met only by head-shaking and pity. The day is closing. The light is fading. Soon we should not have been able to discern each other. But you have come in time. I rejoice that I am come in time, said Duronda, feelingly. He would not say, I hope you're not mistaken in me. The very word mistaken, he thought, would be a cruelty at that moment. But the hidden reasons why I need you began afar off, said Mordecai. Began in my early years when I was studying in another land. Then ideas, beloved ideas, came to me because I was a Jew. They were a trust to fulfill because I was a Jew. They were an inspiration because I was a Jew and felt the heart of my race beating within me. They were my life. I was not fully born till then. I counted this heart and this breath and this right hand. Mordecai had pathetically pressed his hand against his breast and then stretched its wasted fingers out before him. I counted my sleep and my waking and the work I fed my body with and the sights that fed my eyes. I counted them, but as fuel to the divine flame. Okay, we're going to move on a little bit. I'm just going to give you some excerpts here so you can kind of get a feel for the storyline and for the style of this novel. Definitely, you can tell here though that Mordecai is telling Duronda this, and he's beginning to get excited. All right, so he goes on to tell a little bit more of his backstory. So he's explaining he's not just an ignorant dreamer. In fact, he says English is my mother tongue. England is the native land of this body, which is but as a breaking pot of earth around the fruit-bearing tree, whose seed might make the desert rejoice. How prophetic is that? But my true life was nourished in Holland, at the feet of my mother's brother, a rabbi skilled in special learning. And when he died, I went to Hamburg to study, and afterwards to Göttingen, that I might take a larger outlook on my people and on the Gentile world, and drink knowledge at all sources. I was a youth. I felt free. I saw our chief seats in Germany. I was not then in utter poverty. And I had possessed myself of a handicraft. For I said, I care not if my lot be as that of Joshua ben Hananiah. After the last destruction he earned his bread by making needles, but in his youth he had been a singer on the steps of the temple, and had a memory of what was before the glory departed. I said, let my body dwell in poverty, and let my hands be as the hands of the toiler, but let my soul be as a temple of remembrances, where the treasures of knowledge enter, and the inner sanctuary is hope. I knew what I chose. All right, so just a couple notes here. You can hear this. You can definitely hear the story of Emanuel Deutsch reflected in Mordecai's story. Deutsch literally did learn from. Literally did learn at the feet of his uncle, David Deutsch. He was from Germany, and he studied in Germany, and he didn't just study religious Jewish literature either. He was extremely well educated in the non-Jewish world also. So let's continue. I just wanted to point that out to you. They said, he feeds himself on visions, and I denied not, for visions are the creators and feeders of the world. I see. I measure the world as it is, which the vision will create anew. You are not listening to one who raves aloof from the lives of his fellows. Mordecai paused, and Duronda, feeling that the pause was expectant, said, do me the justice to believe that I was not inclined to call your words raving. I listen that I may know, without prejudgment. By the way, that's classic, definitely the mentality that both Emanuel Deutsch and George Eliot had, which was something that was a little bit rare in their generation. As you know, there was kind of this arrogant, imperialistic British attitude at the time, and of course, this huge fight between Judaism and Christianity often left people in a very prejudgmental state. So we'll learn more about this soon, but I just wanted to point that out to you. I listen that I may know, without prejudgment. I have had experience which gives me a keen interest in the story of a spiritual destiny, embraced willingly and embraced in youth. A spiritual destiny embraced willingly? In youth? Mordecai repeated in a corrective tone. It was the soul fully born within me, and it came in my boyhood. It brought its own world, a medieval world, where there were men who made the ancient language live again in new psalms of exile. He goes on to mention a couple famous Jewish figures. So already mentioned was Yehoshua ben Hananiah. After the temple was destroyed, he made a living from making needles, whereas he actually grew up being a singer on the steps of the temple. It also mentions Ibn Ezra and Yehuda Halevi. So these were some great Jewish figures, and the non-Jewish world wouldn't have known of them. So this is an example of how this novel was authentically Jewish. It reflected George Eliot's extensive background research going into it. And you might be really mad at me right now for injecting with all these comments. You're like, stop, just read the story. So anyways, if you're frustrated because you just want me to read the story, please do forgive me. All right. And then speaking of Hebrew and of his Hebrew soul, he says, while it is imprisoned in me, it will never learn another. Have you written entirely in Hebrew then? Said Duronda. Moving on. I'm going to skip a couple more pages here. This is a really long talk that they have. So again, you might want to fill in the blanks for yourself at some point. You can get this as the get this with the PDF. There are the page numbers. You can find it for yourself. All right. He goes. So Mordecai is getting even more excited. That is not all my trust in you. You must be not only a hand to me, but a soul, believing my belief, being moved by my reasons, hoping my hope, seeing the vision I point to, beholding a glory where I behold it. Mordecai had taken a step nearer as he spoke, and now he laid his hand on Duronda's arm with a tight grasp. His face, little more than a foot off, had something like a pale flame in it, an intensity of reliance that acted as a peremptory claim while he went on. You will be my life. It will be planted afresh. It will grow. You shall take the inheritance. It has been gathering for ages. The generations are crowding on my narrow life as a bridge. What has been and what is to be are meeting there, and the bridge is breaking. But I have found you. You have come in time. You will take the inheritance which the base son refuses, because of the tombs which the plow and harrow may not pass over, or the gold seeker disturb. You will take the sacred inheritance of the Jew. All right, so Duronda gets pale too. This guy's right in his face. He's super excited, and so what does it say? So he puts his hand on Mordecai's hand, which happens to be grabbing his arm, if I'm not mistaken, and he says, "Do you forget what I told you when we first saw each other? Do you remember that I said I wasn't of your race?" So Duronda at this point doesn't even know that he's Jewish. "It can't be true," Mordecai whispered immediately with no sign of shock. The sympathetic hand still upon him had fortified the feeling which was stronger than those words of denial. There was a perceptible pause, Duronda feeling it impossible to answer, conscious indeed that the assertion, "it can't be true," had the pressure of argument for him. Mordecai, too entirely possessed by the supreme importance of the relation between himself and Duronda to have any other care in his speech, followed up that assertion by a second, which came to his lips as a mere sequence of his long-cherished conviction. "You are not sure of your own origin." "How do you know that?" said Daniel, with an habitual shrinking which made him remove his hand from Mordecai's, who also relaxed his hold and fell back into his former leaning position. So at this point, Mordecai didn't know that Daniel didn't know who he actually was. "I know it! I know it! What is my life else?" said Mordecai, with a low cry of impatience. "Tell me everything. Tell me why you deny." You can definitely hear the Moses theme there. Moses growing up, not knowing that he's Jewish, so to speak. All right, so those are some excerpts from the talk between Mordecai and Duronda. We're now going to move on to a chapter in the story where Mordecai is at the Philosophers Club. So there's this group of guys that get together and they have intellectual conversations. Mordecai goes and Duronda accompanies him. And they're talking about, quote, the Jewish question. And they're presenting some of the different approaches that were prevalent at that time. Many Jews argued for assimilation. Let's just forget we're Jewish. Let's just basically just assimilate convert to Christianity, assimilate into these European countries, and just end this horrible nightmare that is Jewish existence. So, some viewed this as a rational solution. All right. So one mentions being rational. And we'll cut in once again with one of Mordecai's impassioned speeches, which no doubt reflected some of the things that Emanuel Deutsch shared with his friend George Eliot. He says, in reference to being rational, "And so am I," said Mordecai, quickly leaning forward with the eagerness of one who pleads in some decisive crisis, his long, thin hands clasped together on his lap. "I too claim to be a rational Jew. But what is it to be rational? What is it to feel the light of the divine reason growing stronger within and without? It is to see more and more of the hidden bonds that bind and consecrate change as a dependent growth, yea, consecrated with kinship. The past becomes my parent, and the future stretches towards me the appealing arms of children. Is it Deutsch, by the way, never got married and had children, so in a way, the fulfillment of his vision was his children. Is it rational to drain away the sap of special kindred that makes the families of man rich in interchanged wealth, and various as the forests are various with the glory of the cedar and the palm? When is it rational to say, I know not my father or my mother, let my children be aliens to me, that no prayer of mine may touch them? Then it will be rational for the Jew to say, I will seek to know no difference between me and the Gentile. I will not cherish the prophetic consciousness of our nationality. Let the Hebrew cease to be, and let all his memorials be antiquarian trifles, dead as the wall paintings of a conjectured race. Yet let his child learn by rote the speech of the Greek, where he adjures his fellow citizens by the bravery of those who fought foremost at Marathon. Let him learn to say, that was noble in the Greek, that is the spirit of an immortal nation. But the Jew has no memories that bind him to action. Let him laugh that his nation is degraded from a nation. Let him hold the monuments of his law, which carried within its frame the breadth of social justice, of charity, and of household sanctities. Let him hold the energy of the prophets, the patient care of the masters, the fortitude of martyred generations, as mere stuff for a professorship. The business of the Jew in all things is to be even as the rich Gentile. Yeah, and honestly, I can read that, but I have a hard time actually following the train of thought there. It's really quite complex, if you ask me. But basically, this is his that's his rhetoric in response to this other quote, rational individual. All right, let's continue with a little bit more of Mordecai's responses. Okay, so obviously, we're not reading all of this. This is page 346. We're jumping to page 351. So they've had like 5 pages of conversation. Mordecai is getting more excited. His voice is getting stronger, but also more hoarse. And we'll read a little section here too, where he really casts the vision. In the multitudes of the ignorant on 3 continents, referring to the Jewish people whom, the Gentiles referred to as ignorant. In the multitudes of the ignorant on 3 continents, who observe our rites and make the confession of the divine unity, the soul of Judaism is not dead. Revive the organic center. Let the unity of Israel, which has made the growth and form of its religion, be an outward reality, looking towards a land and a polity. Our dispersed people in all the ends of the earth may share the dignity of a national life, which has a voice among the peoples of the East and the West, which will plant the wisdom and skill of our race, so that it may be, as of old, a medium of transmission and understanding. Let that come to pass, and the living warmth will spread to the weak extremities of Israel, and superstition will vanish, not in the lawlessness of the renegade, but in the illumination of great facts which widen feeling and make all knowledge alive as the young offspring of beloved memories. So basically, Zionism wasn't a thing. There was no Zionist vision. You can almost hear this Zionist vision in like an incipient form. It's like before it was even born, and it was still just forming. And you can even hear even the really original ways that this is described in the novel. Really quite incredible. All right, so let's keep reading here. Mordecai's voice had sunk, but with the hectic brilliancy of his gaze it was not the less impressive. His extraordinary excitement was certainly due to Duronda's presence. It was to Duronda that he was speaking, and the moment had a testamentary solemnity for him, which rallied all his powers. Yet the presence of those other familiar men promoted expression, for they embodied the indifference which gave a resistant energy to his speech. Not that he looked at Duronda. He seemed to see nothing immediately around him, and if anyone had grasped him, he would probably not have known it. Again, the former words came back to Duronda's mind, and remember to the minds of the first readers of this novel. You must hope my hopes. See the vision I point to. Behold the glory where I behold it. They came now with gathered pathos. Before him stood, as a living, suffering reality, what hitherto he had only seen as an effort of imagination, which, in its comparative faintness, yet carried a suspicion of being exaggerated. A man steeped in poverty and obscurity, weakened by disease, consciously within the shadow of advancing death, but living an intense life in an invisible past and future, careless of his personal lot, except for its possibly making some obstruction to a conceived good, which he would never share except as a brief inward vision, a day afar off, whose sun would never warm him, but into which he threw his soul's desire, with a passion often wanting to the personal motives of healthy youth. Let's move on here. I'm going to skip a handful of pages again. And once again, we'll hear from Mordecai. This is one of the most powerful speeches right here. He says, I cherish nothing for the Jewish nation. I seek nothing for them but the good which promises good to all the nations. The spirit of our religious life, which is one with our national life, is not hatred of aught, but wrong. The masters have said, an offense against man is worse than an offense against God. Again, there's George Eliot's research coming through. But what wonder if there is hatred in the breasts of Jews, who are children of the ignorant and the oppressed? What wonder, since there's hatred in the breasts of Christians? Our national life was a growing light. Let the central fire be kindled again, and the light will reach afar. The degraded and scorned of our race will learn to think of their sacred land, not as a place for saintly beggary to await death and loathsome idleness, but as a republic, where the Jewish spirit manifests itself in a new order, founded on the old, purified, enriched by the experience of our greatest sons, having gathered from the life of the ages. How long is it? Only 2 centuries since a vessel carried over the ocean the beginning of the great North American nation. The people grew like meeting waters. They were various in habit and sect. There came a time, a century ago, when they needed a polity, and there were heroes of peace among them. What had they to form a polity with but memories of Europe, corrected by the vision of a better? Let our wise and wealthy show themselves heroes. They have the memories of the East and West, and they have the full vision of a better. A new Persia, with a purified religion, manifested itself in art and wisdom. So will a new Judea, poised between East and West. A covenant of reconciliation. Will any say, the prophetic vision of your race has been hopelessly mixed with folly and bigotry? The angel of progress has no message for Judaism? It is a half-buried city for the paid workers to lay open. The waters are rushing by it as a forsaken field. I say that the strongest principle of growth lies in human choice. The sons of Judah have to choose, that God may again choose them. The Messianic time is the time when Israel shall will the planting of the national ensign. The Nile overflowed and rushed onward. The Egyptian could not choose the overflow, but he chose to work and make channels for the fructifying waters, and Egypt became the land of corn. Shall man, whose soul is set in the royalty of discernment and resolve, deny his rank and say, I'm an onlooker, ask no choice or purpose of me? That is the blasphemy of this time. The divine principle of our race is action, choice, resolved memory. Let us contradict the blasphemy and help to will our own better future and the better future of the world. Not renounce our higher gift and say, let us be as if we were not among the populations, but choose our full heritage, claim the brotherhood of our nation, and carry into it a new brotherhood with the nations of the Gentiles. The vision is there. It will be fulfilled. That was probably the crescendo, by the way, of this whole novel in terms of the vision that was cast. And you can hear it's not just a vision for Israel to be a blessing, to themselves as the Jewish people. It's a vision for Israel to be a blessing to the whole world. All right. So once again, Mordecai just almost goes limp. So those were some excerpts from Mordecai's speeches, which once again were reflections, no doubt, of the vision that Emanuel Deutsch had for his Jewish people. We have another interesting reference here to the Kabbalah, which may have been, once again, the fingerprints of C.D. Ginsburg on this pioneering work. We'll go ahead and read a little bit of this too, because once again, you kind of wonder how George Eliot felt after having lost her friend who had poured so much knowledge into her in their Hebrew lessons and whatnot, and maybe she kind of felt like this. So Mordecai once again is speaking, and he says, in the doctrine of the Kabbalah, souls are born again and again in new bodies till they are perfected and purified, and a soul liberated from a worn-out body may join the fellow soul that needs it, that they may be perfected together, and their earthly work accomplished. Who knows? Maybe Marianne Evans felt this way about her friend Emanuel Deutsch even after he had departed. Then they will depart from the mortal region and leave place for new souls to be born out of the store in the eternal bosom. It is the lingering imperfection of the souls already born into the mortal region that hinders the birth of new souls and the preparation of the messianic time. Thus the mind has given shape to what is hidden, is the shadow of what is known, and has spoken truth, though it were only in parable. When my long wandering soul is liberated from this weary body, it will join yours, and its work will be perfected. Let's read a little bit more. Mordecai's pause seemed an appeal, which Duronda's feeling would not let him leave unanswered. He tried to make it truthful, but for Mordecai's ear it was inevitably filled with unspoken meanings. He only said, "Everything I can in conscience do to make your life effective, I will do." I kind of wonder if that was something that George Eliot was saying to Emanuel Deutsch through this novel. "I know it," said Mordecai, in the tone of quiet certainty, which dispenses with further assurance. "I heard it. You see it all. You are by my side on the mount of vision, and behold the paths of fulfillment, which others deny." He was silent a moment or two, and then went on meditatively. "You will take up my life where it was broken." And then he goes on to remember when exactly his health broke and he got really sick, which is basically what happened to Emanuel Deutsch also. So, moving on in the story, Daniel Deronda meets his mother. She tells him about his true father who passed away, but he left a chest for him of papers and writings in the care of a man named Joseph Colonimus. So Duronda goes and meets Colonimus and gets the chest with the papers and has a little conversation. And this is worth reading also. So this is Duronda speaking. "In being faithful to him, you have caused justice to be done to me. It would have been a robbery of me, too, that I should never have known of the inheritance he had prepared for me. I thank you with my whole soul." "Be worthy of him, young man. What is your vocation?" This question was put with a quick abruptness which embarrassed Duronda, who didn't feel it quite honest to allege his law reading as a vocation. He answered, "I cannot say that I have any." "Get one. Get one. The Jew must be diligent. You will call yourself a Jew and profess the faith of your fathers?" said Colonimus, putting his hand on Duronda's shoulder and looking sharply in his face. "I shall call myself a Jew," said Duronda, deliberately, becoming slightly paler under the piercing eyes of his questioner. "But I will not say that I shall profess to believe exactly as my fathers have believed. Our fathers themselves changed the horizon of their belief and learned of other races. But I think I can maintain my grandfather's notion of separateness with communication. I hold that my first duty is to my own people, and if there is anything to be done towards restoring or perfecting their common life, I shall make that my vocation." It happened to Duronda at that moment, as it has often happened to others, that the need for speech made an epoch in resolve. His respect for the questioner would not let him decline to answer, and by the necessity to answer, he found out the truth for himself. So it's almost like as he's talking, he's hearing what he's saying and discovering what his life's mission, his vocation is going to be. It becomes clear for him. And I want you to take special notice of this term, separateness with communication. That was basically at a time when many advocated for the Jewish people to simply assimilate and throw away their separateness. He advocates for basically ongoing Jewish identity, that they maintain separateness as a people group, but that they also communicate, which basically is good boundaries in any relationship between two individuals or two groups. So again, this is some of the original Zionist vision coming through before Zionism was even a thing. Speaking of pictures, there are a couple more pictures in this version. Here is an artistic version of Mordecai when he first finds Duronda in the bookstore, and I'm not sure, he must have been so excited that his kippah fell off. But yeah, definitely nice beards going on here. And then here's a picture of Duronda and Mira together. That's nice. All right, let's having looked at some of the passages from this novel that most lit up its readers with the original Zionist vision. Let's look at the last 2 pages of the novel. So here's the little note from Gwendolyn. You can read that if you're into Jane Austen novels. And then we'll read this little bit together. Now, they're on their way to the East, which of course is the Middle East, which of course is Israel. And it says, the preparations for the departure of all three to the East began at once. For Duronda could not deny Ezra's wish that they should set out on the voyage forthwith, so that he might go with them, instead of detaining them to watch over him. He had no belief that Ezra's life would last through the voyage, for there were symptoms which seemed to show that the last stage of his malady had set in. But Ezra himself had said, "Never mind where I die, so that I am with you." He did not set out with them. One morning early he said to Duronda, "Do not quit me today. I shall die before it is ended." He chose to be dressed and sit up in his easy chair as usual, Duronda and Mira on each side of him, and for some hours he was unusually silent, not even making the efforts to speak, but looking at them occasionally with eyes full of some restful meaning, as if to assure them that, while this remnant of breathing time is difficult, he felt an ocean of peace beneath him. It was not till late in the afternoon, when the light was failing, that he took a hand of each in his and looking at Duronda, said, looking at Duronda, "Death is coming to me, as the divine kiss, which is both parting and reunion, which takes me from your bodily eyes, and gives me full presence in your soul. Where thou goest, Daniel, I shall go. Is it not begun? Have I not breathed my soul into you? We shall live together." He paused, and Duronda waited, thinking that there might be another word for him. But slowly, and with effort, Ezra, pressing on their hands, raised himself, and uttered in Hebrew the confession of the divine unity, which for long generations has been on the lips of the dying Israelite. In other words, he said the Shema. He sank back gently into his chair, and did not speak again. But it was some hours before he had ceased to breathe, with Mira's and Duronda's arms around him. The end of the novel, but the beginning of the Zionist awakening, the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, the reemergence of Israel as a nation speaking the ancient language of Hebrew as a modern language. And now you know how it started with this story. What we haven't really delved into is the backstory to this story. We haven't really delved into the story of Marianne Evans and her friendship with her dear rabbi, Emanuel Deutsch. So in our next historical conversation, we will really look at that story together. And I think you'll find it to be just as touching and moving, if not more, than this one.